that is one of the goals for that actually. I think, but I like to actually go up. I just see this as
The Lord be with you. And also with you. There's a healthy buzz going on in this room. It sounded wonderful. I hate to interrupt. The schedule is correct for how we're going through this morning. So, following our time together with Gordon, we're going to have a little break, and then we'll gather for a continuation of the general chapter meeting. And I can't wait to see what's going to happen. I don't know what the agenda is. It's great.
Same for us.
Same for us.
14%, and 14% will plan.
I'm trying not to touch anything here so that we don't.
Is that more than a
So I don't
conception
have
of a
food. But I know that you all want to say a word of thanks to Dr. Gordon Lathrop for being here with us this week. It's been delightful for us to have you in our presence and to learn from you. I think we've been richly blessed by what we've heard so far. You've got one more chance.
Don't mess it up.
No pressure.
No pressure. I did ask Gordon for some informal comments that I might use to introduce him, and I've used 2/3 of it. So I saved one piece for last, and it's very brief. And he says, I read a lot. Well, you know, the scholar that he is, my brain goes, duh. Well, of course. But he's recently been reading all of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time.
All 7 volumes, 3,000 pages.
I just finished Barbara Streisand's biography. That was only 1,000 pages. It took me 3 months.
Let's read House Castle.
But he's also reading John Fosse, is that how you pronounce his name? He's a Norwegian author, as I recall, Septology, which is also very interesting. So a well-read, wonderful gentleman who we've been delighted to have with us. And so I give you Gordon Lathrop one more time, but we also have an expression of thanksgiving for him in this card.
Might I ask, when is the appropriate time for us to harass Dr. Lathrop for autographs and signed books?
It's probably already passed.
Dang it.
No. No, Gordon, you're going to be leaving us this afternoon.
I'm
So
going to be leaving at the end of the morning, actually, while the next meeting of the chapter is going on. Lyft Drive is going to come pick me up. So I'm going to leave at 11:30. I'll be here till then.
that's your time frame.
Okay?
But he's busy for a lot of that.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for welcoming me here. A few of you I've known very well and for a long time, and it's been very dear to me to be back in touch with people like Lloyd, Mark, Daniel. But I feel like I've found some new friends, and that's been really lovely to do. And I've very much enjoyed learning about the Orders of Blue much more closely than I knew, and gaining some insight to its what's the word? It's
Temperament.
It's temperament. Exactly. So here's how I'm not gonna blow this third chance, and that is starting by asking you, are there any questions? I'm quite serious. You've heard me talk. So are there comments or questions you'd like to make now before I begin again?
I'm,
Yes, please.
Gordon, I'm curious about your title, being Lutheran. I would have expected almost that it would be the assembly, the fundamental sacrament of the crucified and risen Christ. So I'd just be interested in why you chose risen Christ.
That's a direct quote from Louis-Marie Chauvet, and I will talk about that in a moment. But when I say the risen Christ, I always mean the crucified and risen Christ. There is no other risen Christ. And the risen Christ is still wounded. The wounds don't disappear. That's one of the interesting things you see in the Gospel according to John. So that in fact the whole business of celebrating the crucifixion or marking the crucifixion and celebrating the resurrection separately is not right.
Yeah.
And the great vigil of Easter is still about the cross. And Good Friday is about the resurrection, which you can see in the wonderful use of the Gospel according to John when they come to arrest Jesus. The cohort of soldiers, that's a lot of soldiers. They ask him if he's Jesus of Nazareth. He says, "Ego eimi," I am, and they fall down. That's just amazing. That's all. It's already the resurrection.
Same thing he says.
Anyway. What else? I love your questions, by the way. Yes, please.
I'm pondering an assembly in a house which is small enough that people can be known and know one another, and the assemblies that developed, as the church grew into these bigger sanctuaries,
Yeah.
bigger
Yeah.
spaces where, and even then the pattern that can happen even in a group like this, where we can end up being here and not necessarily be known by one another, and how the lack of knowing and being known takes away from the bonding. of
The gift
assembly.
of assembly.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
That's a fascinating question, and I think it would deserve a couple of doctoral dissertations research and probably not even be able to find enough data about why that was true. But what's interesting to me is that it is true finally that the houses are too enclosed. So how do you get into a house? And it was a right development that Christianity saw they needed to use a public building. So in fact, what Christians used, by the way, was not the temple. They used the Roman public building, the basilica, which was not a religious building except insofar as the adoration of the emperor was always religious, and the emperor's representatives. But what's so interesting is when Christians started to use the basilica, they brought the house into it. So the table originally is not put up in the apse where the bishop would sit, like the Roman imperial officials would sit. The table's put down on the floor, and the people stand around it. So, and it's a table. So there's a domestic input into the basilica that makes the kind of memory of the house gatherings always there. And surely, the council already in Galatians, but in the Deuteropolitan, I think not written by Paul, but written by a follower of Paul, letters of Ephesians and Colossians. There's this profound exhortation to deal with each other in deep respect and love. That I think is always a kind of Christian exhortation. But when you have exhortations like that, it's a pretty clear evidence that it wasn't always happening. So I'm sure, Christians have to break out of the houses. And to try to go back to the house is got problems. Because houses are closed affairs. And Christianity doesn't want to be a closed affair.
And yet we need vulnerability to grow spiritually.
Absolutely.
And a safe space,
100%.
And a very public space, people don't feel safe.
I get it. But isn't it interesting that that much of the domestic was brought into the public in the development of Christian spaces? If you will, it's hard to figure out what's the right space for Christianity, which is why we've been working on it all along. And then finally the public space with the domestic brought inside it was under pressure, so that in fact the domestic material migrated up into the front. And then pretty soon you had a kind of fence. And then pretty soon the fence grew into a screen. And then in the 20th and 21st century, that old domestic reality broke out of that again and came back down into the midst. That's architectural comments, but I think there are spiritual and personal movements going along with that. And good night. Recent history has demonstrated that it's not necessarily always right to imagine that you're safe when you're in church. And that churches need to be attentive to the absence of safety. Thank you for a great question. But why don't you write that?
We might have a little
Yeah, habilitación, I love it. Yeah, that's right. And that's so interesting that in Germany.
Theology, synodality, in Wesleyanism, we call it conferencing, that sort of thing. How are we to understand the difference or the connection between like the assembly of all the laos versus the kind of virtual participation that we have through delegates and bishops and those kinds of things?
You guys have great questions. That's why I thought, let's start with, are there any questions? That's so good. Yeah, I think pointing to the current Roman interest in synodality is a great procedure for that. I think the universal church is not an abstract thing. It can become an abstract thing. It's part of why, I think that's part of why Luther wrote that thing, without place and body, there is no church. I think the elders on Sinai, or representatives from local assembly gathering with other local assemblies, who carry in their bodies a sense of communion with a local assembly, and bring that sense of communion to a sense of communion with other local assemblies that then is represented physically in the synod or in the conference. I think that's true. It's a great idea. Now, the people who carry that representativity have to themselves understand that. They have to know they carry within themselves the bodies of other people. They stand for the bodies of other people. And that doesn't always work. And I think the bishops can start thinking of themselves like they're Byzantine princes. And that isn't helpful. I think in Israel it's probably true that my saying idealistically that the elders represent the people maybe wasn't always so. But the idea that the synod is a sign of the communion of all the local assemblies, I think that's hugely important in Christianity. And then the universal church is not an abstract idea that floats in the empirical. And that's been a problem that Protestant Christianity has had with the Roman Catholic conception of the church as a kind of abstract thing that you only see when you see the hierarchy. Or most of all, you only see when you see the Bishop of Rome. But this current guy, I think, gets it. It's fine with me for him to be the Bishop of Rome for me. I don't give that assent to his successor until the successor earns it. But my wife was in St. Peter's Square when Francis was elected. And I couldn't get there because I'd been teaching a class in Rome and the streets were so filled that I couldn't get into the square. So I went to the Franciscan house where I was staying, and they had a big television screen, so I could watch it. So he comes out on the balcony, and the first thing he does is ask for the people to pray for him, to bless him. And he won't let that great stole be put on him until that happens. And then he introduces himself not as the Pope, but as the Bishop of Rome to the Romans, which is the right thing. That's what he should do. Well, he was already working on synodality, it seems to me. And would to God that our bishops knew that. That we all be working on synodality. But I like your picking up the elders eating and drinking with God as a symbol that could be used in thinking about the communion between the churches. By the way, I think the idea that a bishop should ordain a presbyter means that the presbyter is also being recognized as someone whom the whole church recognizes. Now, in the divided state of Christianity, it's only as much of the whole church as we can get. May the day come when that's not entirely true. But the presbyter, not just the bishop, the presbyter too, stands in a local assembly in communion with the whole church. And that means in communion with real people, in real places, not an abstract idea. That's off the cuff a response to your great question. Anything else? Oh, thank you. I'm sorry to leave you because I'd love to see the rest of your, to see what next happens with your congregation.
Next year in St. Louis.
Okay. Next year in St. Louis, I love it. You've had great officers, and you clearly have great officers coming along. So I want to start with the title I gave to these lectures. And though I've said, especially in answer to Brother Daniel's question about the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, I've said a few things that are not particularly complimentary about the Church of Rome. I want to quote three really important Roman Catholic liturgical scholars of the 20th into the 21st century. The bottom two are 20th, the top one continues to write. And actually, Louis-Marie Chauvet was a professor at the Institut Catholique in Paris, and when he retired from that, he took a parish. And he's just serving as a parish priest, as far as I know, which is very much who he is and what he writes about. So that title, Assembly, the Fundamental Sacrament of the Risen Christ, is actually a quote from a book that Chauvet wrote called The Sacraments. He has a bigger book than that book, but I find the littler book, which is just called The Sacraments, to be still the most useful book. Here's a passage from that book. A church without an assembly would be a contradiction in terms. to designate the Christian phenomenon of the process of birth, in the process of birth, Christians did not find anything better than applying to it the word assembly, or as we translate it, church. This is to say that the gathering is the major characteristic of Christians. That's really interesting. The gathering is the major characteristic of Christians. From this point of view, Christians are people who join their sisters and brothers in an assembly in the name and memory of Jesus. I can't be a Christian without you.
Yes.
We are Christians by being together. Such an assembly, and this is the core thing, such an assembly is the primary mark or the fundamental sacrament of the risen Christ. Now, the risen Christ may encounter us in a lot of other places, like the Spirit of God blows where it will. But I think Chauvet is right. The fundamental sacrament of the risen Christ, the place where the risen Christ is in the assembly of the body. And what I was trying to say yesterday about the Gospels is that I think the Gospels are best and rightly read when you see that what they are all for about in different ways is about the presence of Christ in the assembly. And I don't mean a ghostly figure in the middle of what is otherwise bodies. I mean the body and our bodies in connection. Our singing, our praying, our baptizing, our celebrating the supper is like the seventh article of the Constitution of Sacred Liturgy says is the presence of the risen Christ. When it's faithful, maybe even when it also is flawed, but not when it turns its back on the crucified and risen Christ. So it doesn't mean anything goes. But at the same time, how I encounter the risen Christ is in that body of believers. Robert Hugga, the second name there, was the one of those three people I knew best and was a splendid man. By the way, he was a gay man, which he made publicly clear toward the end of his life, who lived celibately, but was not afraid to say that he was gay, and was, never got any great accolades from the church. But a splendid liturgist, probably the best presider I ever saw. And he said, and this is wonderful, talking about the church gathering, the assembly, he said, the strongest and clearest sign of Christ in the room is not the cross, it's not the altar, it's not even the bread and wine on the altar, it is this assembly of believers. That's, if you want to see Christ, as our abbot told us at the opening sermon, lift up your head, look around. And it's in some ways, in more theological language, that's what Chauvet is saying as well. And that's really what I hoped that these three presentations have been about. I think, as I tried to make clear yesterday, that we've lost a little of the urgency of that idea, and that the recovery of that urgency, the profound importance of that urgency, is part of your vocation. Part of what you vowed to care about. So I thought to start today, it would be interesting to look first at a couple more alternative signs of the central matters around which Christians gather and of the meaning of that assembly. So here's the first one. That's a font in North Africa. It's right now, actually, I think it's no longer in place. It's been gathered into the Bardo Museum in Tunis, in Tunisia. But fonts in North Africa frequently look like this. I really love it because it's cruciform, but in a kind of rounded way. And it's covered with, flowers. A place of life, if you will, not unimaginably called the womb of the church. That's an alternative way to think about baptismal fonts. Here's an alternative way to think about what a church looks like. This is a church in Bornholm in Denmark. There's several round churches in Denmark. And an author by the name of George Rund Murphy wrote a book called Tree of Salvation. That's essentially about how the culture of the North, especially the so-called Viking culture, wound up being a source of enculturation when Christianity came into the North. And the interesting thing about these round churches is that they are not just round churches, they're round churches with a central pole. And the central pole under which the congregation gathers looks a lot like a very big tree. And in fact, sometimes the tree branches are painted on the ceiling inside. Sometimes that even you can see the from the central pillar wooden supports like branches reaching out. And Murphy says he thinks the builders of these churches meant them to remind Norse people of Yggdrasil, the great tree in Norse myth, which, according to some of the most interesting of those myths, maintained in Iceland, would, when the world fell apart at what they called Ragnarok, or Götterdämmerung in Wagner's version of it, when the world fell apart, humankind would take refuge in the tree. And much of humankind would be destroyed, but some would find their way to the tree, and in the tree find shelter, so that finally when Ragnarok was over, they could come out of the tree and begin humanity. That's the myth. Well, in the center of this church, let me get it. The pillar, that's the pillar. It has painted on it an image of the Nativity. It also has it painted, so the beginning, if you will. It also has it painted on an image of the Last Judgment. But the pillar in this church, that's not true of all the churches, but in this one, in a place called Lusterlars, has, I think you can barely see it, but has right in the middle, has an empty place under the pillar, and right in the middle has a great stone baptismal font. So that in fact, the interesting thing is in the Yggdrasil myth, at the base of Yggdrasil there was a spring, but that was tended by the fates, if you will. Well, here the spring is the baptismal font. Here, what shelters the people in the face of threat is the assembly of the church. And the assembly of the church is birthed from this. And gathering in the church, one gathers sheltered from the storm, if you will. But then humanity, in the Norse myth, it's a man and a woman emerge from the tree to live the new life in the world. That's another image of assembly. And it's striking to me. So if you ever get a chance, go to Bornholm and look at those churches. But a really interesting thing would be for you to look for this amazing book. It's not just these churches. Murphy argues the so-called stage churches in Norway, the great wooden churches in Norway, of which there's one replica in Rapid City, by the way, were also built to be Yggdrasil. Well, that is to say, tree of life in Christ. But it's not just fonts and buildings. There's also baptism like this in a river, in which the natural world becomes the place where the assembly is founded. What you don't see here is that I've seen more pictures of this baptism, but on the banks of this river in Montana, the congregation is there. Ready to welcome this girl, to dry her off and clothe her in the garb of baptism when she comes out of the river. Or there's this. That's an image of the oldest Christian font we know. It was found in a place called Dura Europos, which is in Syria, a Roman colonial town that was destroyed in the 3rd century. But what was found were the remains of a Christian house church. A house church where the walls, by the way, had been knocked down, so that in fact there was more room for people. But where one of the rooms was turned into a bedroom. And the fascinating thing is to interpret the imagery on the wall of that room as it's been reconstructed, as painted to interpret what's happening in baptism. For example, these women may be the women coming to the tomb on Easter Sunday morning, and if you will, the font is where someone is brought in to participate in that death and resurrection. But another interpretation, and probably the one that right now among scholars is gaining more acceptance, is that these women represent the 5 bridesmaids who still had lamps burning. And that this isn't the tomb, this is a tent where the marriage is taking place. And in that case, then the baptism is being married to God, if you will. The baptism is, in fact, the marriage. And there's more images around the room. So there's an image of Peter walking on the water, and yet being saved from drowning. They're one of the wonderful ones at a place in the room that they think was the place where anointing took place before baptism in that old Syrian practice. The anointing was before baptism. There's a painting of David killing Goliath. And the old idea was that the candidate for baptism is like an athlete going into the games to struggle with the opposition. and athletes used to be anointed head to toe. And that the competition here is with the devil, and the Christian will survive, like David, if you will. If you're interested in that, there's a book that's not hard to find. It's just called The World's Oldest Church. I'm not right now blanking on the name of the author, but you'll find it by that title, which has a kind of interpretation of the imagery. By the way, that house church was excavated largely by an archaeological team that was delegated by Yale University. And the remains of the house church, because they were no longer in place, and it's a good idea because in fact, the site of Dura was largely destroyed and robbed by ISIS in a kind of a horrible thing that they were doing at that time. The remains of this church are in New Haven, Connecticut. And if you go to the New Haven Art Museum, there is a room full of material from Dura, and what remains of those paintings is there to be seen in the Yale Art Museum. They didn't quite reconstruct this room, which I wish they had. You have to use your imagination to see it as a room. But that's another sense of an alternative sense of assembly, if you will. And then one can think of the kind of hundreds of artistic illustrations of biblical stories that help us to see assembly. This one, of course, the feeding of the 5,000, which we heard in our prayer, as an image of what churches do. By the way, of course, that 12 baskets full of fragments are left over. Or in the feeding of the 4,000 story in Mark, 7 baskets full, points to the numbers you get in the book of Acts, where the disciples, if you will, the 12, are continuing to pass out the bread in the church. Only in Acts, the 12 decide they don't want to serve tables anymore, so they appoint the 7, and the deacons, if you will, serve tables. That's not in the text. I think it's a legitimate interpretation of the text. And then we're back to a minute. We're back to an image we've seen already. Yet another image of assembly. Everything at a single time. From the Torslanda frontal in the National Museum of Denmark. But here's another one. This is probably one of my favorite images in the world. It's in Constantinople, in the church called the Chora Church, C-H-O-R-A. Chora means in the country, and it was in fact, at the time it was built and decorated, it was a church outside the walls. Unfortunately, when I was there, it was open as a museum. Unfortunately, it's now been once again converted into a mosque under the authority of the current president of Turkey, who understands himself as appealing to an Islamic constituency. The people I know in Constantinople were horrified by that idea. They wanted Turkey to be a secular state. But it's not right now. I think it's still closed because they're in the process of converting it into a mosque. I just hope they don't paint over this image. That's what the Eastern Church uses as an image of the resurrection. And not the Western image of Jesus climbing out of the tomb or standing victorious with a floating banner. but the image of Christ standing on boards over the mouth of hell. Sometimes the boards are formed in the form of a cross, by the way, and pulling up out of hell Adam and Eve, one in each hand. My wife and I call this the equal opportunity resurrection. Because unfortunately, sometimes the form of this icon is of Jesus grabbing Adam's hand and Eve clutching onto Adam's foot or something as they get pulled out. Not here. One hand for each. The faithful of the ages are there awaiting their turn to be pulled out. And here's the interesting thing. In the Cora Church, there is a long side chapel, which is sometimes thought that it was a funerary chapel. This painting was made, by the way, in the 14th century, so not long before the yielding of Constantinople to the Turks. But in that, so this is in the apse, the apsidal dome, if you will. On the wall of the nave of this side chapel, there's an image here, and there's an image there. On this side, there's an image of Jairus and his daughter, with the daughter being raised. On this side, there's an image of the widow of Nain with the widow's son being raised. More equal opportunity, by the way. And sort of surrounded by these images. The images themselves contain a whole company of people. So that in fact, once again, the image is meant as an image of assembly with the risen Christ, but pulling us up to life. Men and women together, pulling us up to life. If you're interested in this, by the way, John Dominic Crossan, whom you may know as a biblical scholar, together with his wife, has written a book. I think it was in 2019. It's called The Resurrection of Easter, in which he weighs in really strongly about how important this image is by comparison to the Western image. Because in fact, in this resurrection, the assembly is pulled up together with Christ into life. Well, I just wanted you to see those as a way to hold before us artistically, some extent architecturally, the deep history of assembly unity. But there's one more thing I'd like to do, and that is to think with you about, given this, what does it practically mean? What shall you do? Now, I hope it means you help people look at least some of those scriptures I wanted to think about with you, that you help people think about the importance of the assembly, that you teach in season and out of season. But I think there's more. It's also how we carry ourselves. One of the things to look at is to remember again what I gave to you in giving to you the earliest description of the Sunday assembly that we have from that first apology of Justin Martyr. And you can find that in a lot of places if you want the text itself. Probably you could find it online. I've never tried, but I'm sure you could. But let me remind you, Justin says, first he talks about baptism, and then he says, then we remind each other all the time that we are baptized. And here's how we do it. We share what we have with the poor. That's what baptismal life. We often meet together and we give thanks over everything we eat. And then he begins, on the day named after the sun, on Sunday, we meet together in one place, all together in one place, whether we're from the country or the city, which is interesting. Although writing in Rome at that time, there would have been more than one Sunday assembly, even in the early second century. But in those Sunday assemblies, Justin is at pains to point out that people who gather there are not all from the same neighborhood. And then gather in one place. It's the same word, by the way, in Greek that is used in Acts when it talks on Pentecost about the disciples being gathered together in one place. That's not a bad image for Luther's body and place, if you will. Gathered together in one place. Then he says, then he says the scriptures are read, what he calls the memoirs of the apostles and the writings of the prophets. Memoirs of the apostles, he probably means the Gospels. He may also mean Paul. And the writings of the prophets, he means everything that we would call the Old Testament. And when the reader is finished, so we already see in that text that there's more than one ministry. There's a reader. When the reader is finished, and probably that's a special gift. Not everybody could read aloud. And if you know what texts were like back in those days, probably gathered together in a codex. Christians essentially invented codexes. What was used before and still continuing in Christian time were scrolls. Scrolls are harder to find your place. And Christians want to read a variety of texts. So what really worked better for them was a codex. Besides which, the codex could be carried and brought into the assembly. When the reader is finished, the presider, that's the exact word that Justin uses, proestos, the one who stands in front of us or before us. The presider in a discourse invites us exhorts and invites us into the imitation of these beautiful things. He calls them takala, which means both beautiful and good. I've often thought that's an interesting early description of Christian preaching. Exhortation and invitation into these beautiful things. And what are the beautiful things in the scriptures? Well, they are, of course, the astonishing story of human failure. That's what's so interesting about the Old Testament. It's not a story of great success. The astonishing story of human failure and the overwhelming story of God's grace, God's mercy. And preeminently the story of human failure and God's mercy in the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Exhorting us to be aware of the failure, inviting us to come into the life, into the mercy. That's what I think is meant. Lutherans call that preaching law and gospel. And I think that's already there in Justin. Then when the presider has concluded, we all stand together and offer prayer. Already, the church praying for the needs of the world is present in that second century. The interesting thing is the synagogue called the great list of 14 blessings, which were also kind of intercessions. They called the synagogue, the rabbis usually called that prayer the Amidah, which means the standing prayer. And this is one place where posture is mentioned in Justin. We all stand together and offer prayer. But we are all doing it. Obviously, somebody is leading us, but we are praying. And what should be intercessions has come and gone in Christian life. But I think the most profound insight is the prayer for the need of the world, not for ourselves. That these prayers are really directed outward and are accurately, acutely pointed toward the current agonies. So I think American churches should be praying for this coming election, that we avoid the destruction that's possible. Then, says Justin, bread and wine and water are brought. It's really interesting. It's wine and water. Understand that in the second century, wine was not ever drunk without water being added. Wine that's ready to be drunk is called mix. And depending how good the wine is, you judge how much water was there. And some of the wine was probably not very good. But that addition of water that continues to this day in some liturgical practice in the Christian church. You'll see it in a Roman church, in some Anglican churches, maybe some Methodist churches, I don't know. But the addition of water to the cup is simply a memory of that old practice that you always added water. It's been turned into a kind of secondary symbol, like an indication of the blood and water that flowed from the side of Christ on the cross. But early on, it was simply practical. Bread and wine and water are brought, and the presider prays and gives thanks, that's what it says, as well as he can. Yeah, isn't it true? As beautifully as he can. I think it's so true that one of the things we look for in leaders of our assembly is the ability to exhort and invite us from these texts and pray magnificently at the table of the Lord. Then these things of the Thanksgiving, they're actually called in Greek Thanksgivingized things, as a passive participle, are shared. And the deacons are sent to bear them away to those who are not with us. It's quite clear that there are Christians sick, working, they're slaves, or in prison, to whom deacons bear food. By the way, bearing food to prison, that was not an easy thing. And there were no refectories in ancient prisons. If people didn't remember you with food, you starved. Then those of us who have means, present from our means to the presider. And the presider sees to it that these means, it's never identified, but it seems to mean both food and money. These means are distributed to orphans and widows, the imprisoned, strangers in the city, in short, to those in need. And the presider is a guardian to all those in need. So there you have a working out in an actual account of an assembly of what I said is present in Luke chapter 24. The constitution of an assembly, the interpretation of the word, the reading and interpretation of the word, the keeping of a meal. The intercessions are not so clearly present in the Emmaus story, but they come to be in Christian practice. The sharing of a meal and the sending. In the case of Justin, the sending of communion to the absent, but also the sending of assistance to the poor as an every Sunday reality. And then Justin says, and we do this on the first day of the week, because on that day God began to create the world. Yeah, so he's using Genesis 1 and understanding Sunday as a memorial of creation, every Sunday as a memorial of creation. And because on that day, Jesus Christ, whom you killed, that's what literally in the text, whom you killed, was raised up. And he taught us these things, which we've now said before you, period, end of quote. What's so stunning to me about looking at that text from the 2nd century is to think, we're still doing it. It's what you'll do next Sunday. And the depth of it in Justin, the simplicity of it, can be taught and can refresh our own practice. 2 notes from that. One, Justin says that the Sunday gathering is a specific case of us remembering that we were baptized. Because its specific case is that we meet together, we give thanks over what we eat, and we share what we have with the poor. And we do those things because we're baptized into Christ. And we do them to recall that we are baptized. Second, it's an early image of the fact that the assembly has many ministries. There's in Justin, there's a reader, there are deacons. You could guess there are people who bring the bread and wine. There are people who help us with the prayers. And there is, underline this, a presider. Don't take offense at this, but let's stop calling the principal clergy person in the room the celebrant. The pastor is not the celebrant. The assembly is. And the pastor is our presider who stands in our midst. Aidan Kavanaugh says wonderfully, the presider does not preside over us, but among us, one of us. And Kavanaugh uses this figure of speech. The presider is the speaker of our house of worship. Not our ruler, but the one who leads us in this communal exercise that involves the entire assembly and many people helping the assembly. Let's pause there and look at those many people and think about it. One of the really interesting inventions of late 20th, early 21st century liturgical renewal in all of our churches was the reemergence of lay people as assisting ministers in the assembly. And I like that word, assisting ministers, though it runs a certain danger. It sometimes gets interpreted as if this is an assistant pastor in the congregation, and the assistance is going to the pastor himself or herself, or to the presider in the meeting. I don't think that's what's meant. I think the assistance goes to the assembly. Assisting ministers are assisting the assembly. And, in many of our churches, that's become wonderful vocation. A holy vocation. Called to be a reader, to allow your body, projecting a voice into the room, to be the means of the Word of God alive in the room. That's a sacred ministry. And in fact, then we likely look for people who can read and who can treasure that as a ministry. And given those gifts, we train them. We try to help people read so that in fact the congregation can clearly hear this word, and so that they don't just hear the reader. But the reader becomes vessel, means, a servant to the word. Or there's the holy ministry of standing for the assembly, holding the bread or the cup, and helping to give the bread and the cup to people who come. I've known people who became Christians again when their faith was lagging by being ministers of the chalice, by seeing those faces and saying, in that wonderful plural, by the way, the blood of Christ for you. That's not a singular. It's not for thee. It's for you, for the plural assembly being given to you, the servant of God. That's another holy ministry. Or singing. That's another assisting ministry. And the chief of those assisting ministers who sing with us, I found wonderfully called in recent times the leader of assembly song. Cantor is interesting. That's an old Christian name for the leader of assembly song, the parish musician. But I really like leader of assembly song at the time because it points again to the community. And that the goal isn't an audience listening to wonderful music, the goal is a singing community. Sometimes a single voice sings for us, rather like the elders represent the people, if you will. Sometimes a single voice sings for us, but always in dialogue with the whole assembly, and in service to the whole assembly. And then there is the presider. Among these ministers, one of these ministers, a really important one that became overweeningly important in 18th, 19th, and 20th century among us, so that in fact it seemed like that was only the presider who was doing anything in church. The rest of us were just sitting in the pew. Not anymore. And that vocation to service, which we've heard several texts about in the course of the time together, and we'll hear again this coming Sunday as the gospel. That vocation to service is hugely important in Christian history. The chief among us must serve tables. I am among you as one who serves. Who is greater, the one who sits at table, actually reclines in the text, the one at table or the one who serves? Surely it's the one who sits at table. But I am among you as one who serves, says Jesus in the Lucan Passion. Okay. So that in fact, learning again what that service is, not false humility, not making people see how humble you are, but because presiders have authority. They rightly have authority, but the authority needs to be exercised in service and in love. What I always used to say is congregations know it when their pastors don't really love them.
Yeah, they do.
When it's real clear the pastor would rather be anywhere else. And of course, when that happens, it's time to lay down the job. it's really important that the pastor in fact care about the people before him and or her, and especially care about the people on the margins of that gathering that are just barely there. A presider who sees those people and imagines himself or herself in their place is a presider who can begin to see the whole assembly. I think that the new vocation to presiding a service, which is the old vocation, is very beautiful and worth your life if you are called to that task. So, besides these people, all of us in the assembly are there actively, praying, singing, giving thanks, helped by the order of St. Luke, increasingly involving their body in such praying, singing, giving thanks. It was really moving to me to watch a largely Protestant order of Christians bowing to each other yesterday as you entered the room. In a way you'll only see elsewhere in a Benedictine monastery, where you will see it, by the way, just exactly like that. That recovery of a deep bow, not just to the holy things, but to each other, the primary sign of Christ in the room, is a remarkable recovery. So our bodies involved in full, knowledgeable participation in the mystery of Christ, which is what the old text said about full participation. Not just full participation, period. It's full participation in the mystery of Christ. And then, when we come to the end of that assembly gathering, helped by all those various ministries following that ordo, and we come to be sent. Another recovery of the late 20th and early 21st century has been a new accent on the conclusion of the service as sending. Not just blessing people, but sending. The Western form of the liturgy was called Mass, from the old cry of the deacon at the end of the liturgy, Ita missa est. So missa came to be the name for the whole thing. And missa means sent. Ita missa est means it, go, get out of here. It's what's sent? Well, there's been a lot of talk about that. One theory was that what was called the fermentum, some of the bread from the Eucharist at this table, was sent to neighboring congregations, especially if it was from the table of the Bishop of Rome, was sent to the other stational churches in Rome, and a little of that bread put into the chalice. You'll still see the kind of the fragment of that old symbol in the contemporary Roman Mass, where a little bit of the bread is dropped in the chalice, but it doesn't have anything of the old meaning of a communion between this assembly and assembly somewhere else, especially the assembly of the bishop. Maybe that's what meant, the fermentum is sin. I think it could also be from Justin Simon, help to the poor has been sent. And I think we have to take that seriously. At one point I said, I never quite filled my own exhortation, but we ought not ever celebrate the Eucharist if we don't send to the poor. But that belongs essentially to what Eucharist is. And Yet third, I think the assembly is a better interpretation of it. And what is a wonderful thing has happened in current times is that we've been recovering that sending. You'll find texts in recent liturgical books. The Methodist Book of Worship being only one. So that all of this accent on the assembly is finally accent on people in Christ being sent for the sake of the life of the world. And with that, I've said what I want to say. But I would be really glad for any further questions. We still have a little time. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said about the artwork
Yeah,
and not being a representation of death and resurrection, but the marriage
gorgeous.
and the use of water there.
Yeah,
And then you mentioned the adding of water and wine in the Catholic tradition. We still do that. So when we do that, we say by the mingling of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ. Then we add the water.
Yeah,
Who humbled himself to share in our humanity.
yeah,
And that, I think, and I never thought about it that way, kind of speaks back into that baptismal marriage.
I love
that
it.
unification of
I love
matter and
it. It's
divine.
beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yeah, just.
Yeah, so the water began practically, but it came to be a focus of really interesting symbolic development. One of the early ones was what I said about the Johannine account of water and wine from the side of the cross of the crucified. But another one is the one you point to, and that is the joining of the human and divine Christ.
And I think in that sense, it lends into that imagery of that marriage.
That's gorgeous. Thank you. That's beautiful. Yes.
I don't know if this might be a pushback, but maybe it's just a more of a clarification, because.
Well, pushback as well.
It was there in your comments where you said that we are to, ascending to the poor.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit more, maybe give us some more understanding on this, because for me, that would imply, if we're talking about going to the poor, well, the implication is that the poor aren't here.
That's
So
right.
I think, yeah, so I wonder, I'm curious about this. We certainly we should anticipate and desire more for the poor, the marginalized, the unhoused, those living on the land. The ones being sent, like they're here with us, and we send them out. So I'm wondering, maybe a better way of thinking it is, we're sending people out into the mission field where there are those who are not among us. So maybe rather than talking about sending to the poor, are you talking about just like giving resources to those who lack resources, or what do you mean by, to whom are we being sent? I guess
Gorgeous. That's a good pushback. Thank you very much. I agree with you that using that kind of language, actually even talking about the poor at all, is a way of kind of dividing up humanity, which isn't necessarily welcome. I like the line in Nehemiah, those for whom nothing is prepared. And maybe that's poor, maybe it's not. And maybe what needs to be prepared is not just food, but also care or welcome or invitation to fellowship.
Yeah.
So I think I think your idea of talking about, there's the word mission, which is related to misa. And for us to see again, Mass and Sunday liturgy as related to mission is the major thing I want to talk about. And I think I get myself into trouble you rightly point out, by using only the poor, because in fact it is true that if you talk about people who have a few resources, some of them, many of them may be in the room, or part of the assembly.
Yeah.
Could be the sick and infirm.
Pardon?
The sick and infirm.
Yeah, the sick and infirm as well, sure, absolutely right, yes. No, so what I'm talking about is mission. I suppose if I use the word for, it's because I don't want us to forget those for whom nothing is prepared. You know.
What I would hope is that those for whom nothing is prepared are in the room, like are in the assembly.
Yeah,
So
no,
the
I
question
do too,
is,
but I
who's
hope
not
that,
in the assembly?
but I hope
That's
that
the
what's,
question.
yeah, that's right, that I hope that what's happened in the assembly is that what has been prepared has been set before them and given to them. Okay, and so that now, having received that, they turn to the others who are, or for whom nothing is prepared. So, no, that's great, thank you. Yes,
I was wondering, I've done a fair bit of thinking about the placement of what we would call the offertory now.
yeah,
And kind of the giving of alms, and I come from a reform context, and I've always been amused by the line at the end of the Westminster Directory for Worship, that the ordering of the poor shall be, the collection of the poor shall be so ordered as it doesn't conflict with any of the parts of worship. It just comes in as an afterthought. But then, of course, in the liturgical kind of renewal movement in the 19th and 20th century, it becomes a very key, very much present part of the liturgy, but not in the last part of the liturgy, somewhere up front.
okay,
Or before the reading of the word.
okay.
I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about your understanding of the offertory, both as preparation of the table and as collection of alms, and what your thoughts are on the liturgical part.
I think the idea of setting the table and collecting alms at the same time has been a good idea. And that it is a way to associate the Eucharist with almsgiving, or if you will, giving to organizations of relief. I mean, so the congregation may share its own resources with, in my case, Lutheran World Relief, or Lutheran Disasters Service. And I think that association is good. It's been fascinating to me that the Japanese Evangelical Lutheran Church got really interested in being serious about what's injustice. And in their renewal of their agenda, of their ordo, in Japan, what they've published, it hasn't been universally accepted or everywhere used, but has put the collection of alms at the end of the liturgy, where it is injustice, if you will, which is interesting. That's where it is in Nehemiah 8 too. Is at the end, sending for those for whom nothing is prepared is at the end, in relationship to meal preparation, and I think that's fine. So I just want what you said has been really clear in recent liturgical reform, a rediscovery, at least thinking about what sending means. And I'm glad for you to think about that. I don't have any absolute answers, and I want to be careful with my language, like I've been pointed out. Yes, go ahead.
It strikes me that there's something resonating here with our work on the resources for the order, particularly in terms of the word the table. That as your team struggles with how to formulate the ending of our own services, we recognize that in a lot of our churches today, the benediction and the sending forth has been so blended together that one or the other gets left out. So recognizing that might also be a problem, we've separated them, so that the blessing is there, or the abbot's commendation and blessing is when we are here and the abbot, or in the abbot's name when the abbot isn't there. Abbot always being present to the sign of our unity in the order. And that last act, the rubrics remind us, is best done not by the presider and certainly not by a cleric. It is to be done by a layperson, by a deacon, by anybody else than somebody that has that kind of ordination authority But what struck me yesterday was that the thing has come full circle. Who was it who sent us forth? Our abbot, who is a laywoman. Hallelujah!
I think like the interesting thing is historically, the sending forth is way older than the benediction. What seems to be the case is that the benediction comes into use when the sent assembly begins to leave the room. Some of the people come to the bishop for a blessing before they go. Some of the people, in an Episcopal liturgy, if you will. If there's no Episcopal liturgy, there's probably no blessing. There is always a sending in the ancient liturgy. The ELCA and the ELW, as you are aware, tried to solve the problem by, in fact, having a blessing and then always having a sending. And the sending is always spoken by the Sistine ministry. And there's been a kind of diversity of language for the sending. One of my favorites, I had some effect on it being used, though it is liable to the same misunderstanding that we were talking about earlier. One of my favorites in the ALW is, "Go in peace, remember the poor." And the people say, "Thanks be to God," and leave. Remember the poor, of course, is a biblical quotation from Galatians. When Paul gets the agreement of the bigwigs in Jerusalem to his mission and to his congregations, if only they're quite agreed that Gentiles can be baptized and all that, if only you will remember the poor. And, some people think the Christians in Jerusalem were sometimes called the poor, and that what's going on is remember us in Jerusalem. And in fact, Paul takes collection for the church in Jerusalem, which could be understood as a collection for the poor. It's certainly for people who are undergoing famine. But all that to the side, I love what you say about the sending, not being the presider's voice, but a voice from someone in the congregation. Yes.
So we had breakfast the other day and I was talking about my dinner church. And
Yes.
so I find this conversation fascinating because I have a lot of poor there.
Yeah.
And so for me to say that in that context, it would be weird. And so then it's like, okay, then do we say remember the rich? And so that's kind of a weird way of saying that. But I find that very fascinating to bring in our conversation of assuming that they're not there versus they are there.
Absolutely
and so
right.
you have to change the language that are in some of our liturgies.
No, that's why I'm back to those for whom nothing is prepared. But what was so interesting in that conversation that you and I had that I really liked was your acknowledgement that there's a lot of people who come for the food, but haven't yet found the courage to come into the assembly.
Yes.
And finding the link there is a pastoral task.
Yes.
And related to that is a thing we also talked about that I mentioned earlier, and that is that the house, the dinner table in the house has its dangers because it's limited. But God knows our churches are limited. Even if there's not a physical barrier there are barriers to it that we need to work on pastorally. But thank you, and thanks for what you do.
Absolutely, and we have a tagline that says, "Come for the food, stay for the community,"
Yeah.
trying to get people to think there's something beyond just the food that you receive.
Yeah, good, great. I think we should stop. I'm sorry to say.
Someone left their folder in the, at breakfast with all their great notes from yesterday, but no name.
Okay.
It's right here.
It being 10:30, the schedule calls for us to be done. I loved talking with you, and I want to thank you once again for welcoming me so richly into your midst. God bless the order. God bless your new abbot. I'll remember you in prayer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We wish you safe travels as you make your way home and give our greetings to Gail.
I will, thank you.